when the wind knows your name. There are places that don't appear on maps. They only exist in the memory of someone who passed through once, a long time ago. There are stories that were never written down, just left behind in the quiet creak of a saddle or the fading warmth of a forgotten fire. And there are names, not carved into stone, but still carried by the wind, like soft echoes of someone who once mattered. Tonight, if you have a moment, I'd like to take you somewhere that no longer exists, a time before cities, before clocks, before promises could be broken by the next sunrise, back to a world of dust, silence, and loyalty. This isn't the story of a king, not a hero you'd find in school books. It's the story of someone who once traded a horse for a piece of bread and carried the weight of that choice through every mile of the life that followed. So turn the light down low and let your mind walk gently with me into a history that breathes, whispers, and still waits to be remembered. The fire still burned. I was never a man of many words. Not back then, and even less now. But there are nights quiet, brittle ones when the fire crackles just right, and my bones ache the way old paths do. And I find myself remembering the kind of remembering that doesn't need permission. Tonight, the smoke curls upward like it used to on the step. The embers are slow and red, and the wool around my shoulders still holds the scent of wind and ash. You wouldn't know it now, looking at this old man with shaky hands and teeth that come and go as they please. But I once rode with the wind, and the wind, back then, was sharp. It was a morning, though we didn't call it that. There weren't clocks, no roosters, just the way the sky grew lighter. Grudgingly, I opened my eyes and saw nothing but grey sky, frost, breath. My blanket was a coat, my bed was dirt, and my bedmate was a horse. He snorted right into my face, the way he always did. Warm mist from his nostrils hit my cheek and froze there. That horse didn't apologize. Mongol horses never do. They are many things: stubborn, clever, judgmental, but never sorry. I shifted, groaning as I peeled myself from the half-frozen earth. He stepped on my sleeve. Of course, he always did. I said nothing. He chewed grass like my discomfort was just part of the scenery, which I suppose it was. Back then, personal space wasn't a thing, neither was rest. If you weren't moving, you were waiting to be left behind. I remember the taste of that morning raw, sour. The air stung my teeth. My jaw ached just from breathing. The kind of cold that isn't content with just your skin, it wants your soul. And it almost got mine, more than once. We were always moving. Even before we mounted our horses, our minds were already galloping. The others were up and gone like smoke. No calls, no chatter, just the creak of leather and the sound of hoofbeats melting into the horizon. I learned fast. If you asked questions, you'd miss the answers. If you waited, you'd get left. So I stood, shook out my coat, tightened the cloth around my waist. My boots were hard as horn, and my fingers too stiff to tie a proper knot. I managed. You always do. Until you don't. Somewhere nearby, a boy 10, maybe less, was already riding. Bow longer than his arms strapped across his back. He yawned as he passed me, not out of boredom, but because that was just the pace of our world. You could be galloping toward death and still need a nap. I liked that about him. You didn't eat before riding. There was no breakfast table, no fire, no good morning. You rode, and if your jaw was strong enough, you chewed on dried mutton until it stopped resisting. If your teeth hurt, well, they'd get used to it, or they'd fall out. Either way, problem solved. That morning, like most, my stomach grumbled. But I ignored it. Hunger was as constant as the wind, and just as talkative. We had a deal, hunger, and it complained. And I didn't listen. By the time the sun showed up, we'd already switched horses once. The first one was winded, so I gave him a nod, hopped off, and climbed onto the next without slowing. We didn't waste energy on gratitude. We gave that to the road. You had to be harder than your horse. That was the rule. If he limped, you rode smoother. If he faltered, you steadied him. There was no pity, only partnership. The wind turned sharper near the third ridge. It hit my cheekbone like a slap, numbed my lips, stole my breath. I remember wondering if anyone else noticed. No one did. Of course not. We all had our own wind to fight. That was the thing about the steppe. It didn't care, not about your name, not about your pain. If you kept moving, it gave you more to survive. If you stopped, it forgot you quickly. I moved now, sitting here, bones wrapped in a blanket that used to be a saddlecloth. I smile at how little we thought of comfort. We didn't crave it. We barely believed in it. What we had was momentum, and a kind of peace that came from not expecting anything to be easy. Sometimes I wonder what happened to that horse, the one who snorted me awake and stepped on my coat. He lived longer than most people I knew. He never learned manners, but he never let me freeze. Maybe that's all the love we had to give each other. Have you ever shared space with something wild? Something that didn't love you, but kept you alive anyway? Morning has no names here. I never had a pillow. I had a saddle. We didn't call it morning. We didn't call it anything. Really, it was just the hour when the wind got teeth again, when the light pulled at the edges of your eyelids, and the horses shifted with that low, resigned grunt that meant time to go. No one came to wake you. No bells, no songbirds, just the world nudging you awake, the same way a boot nudges a log that might still have some fire left in it. I remember that hour as grey. Not cold exactly, though it was just grey in feeling, the kind of colour you carry in your chest when you know your day doesn't belong to you. I sat up slow, not out of laziness, but because every joint argued with me. Bones learn early that sleep on the ground is not rest. It's rehearsal for being buried there someday. My saddle was still warm. I'd used it as a pillow, not because it was comfortable, but because it was mine. In a world that kept moving, anything you kept close was a kind of promise. I always slept with one hand tucked under the horn, the other curled around the leather cinch like it might run off without me. Once, during my first month riding with the caravan, I left it a few feet away to stretch my legs. A boy couldn't have been older than 9 took it, just scooped it up, and walked away with the calm of someone who thought everything on the ground was free. He didn't get far. One of the elders caught him and handed it back to me without a word. Just a glance. That was enough. That saddle had more history than some names in our tribe. I chewed a strip of meat that had frozen in the night. It cracked like kindling. You don't wait for flavor out there. You chew because that's the only warmth you'll get until midday. And even then, it comes from inside your own mouth. Some of the older riders were already gone. No hoofbeats. No goodbyes just gone. Like smoke off a fire that no longer needs them. You learn fast that no one waits for the slow, not even kindness. So I packed fast, tied knots by memory, and ran my hand along my horse's side to feel for stiffness. He flinched. I whispered nothing in particular. Mongol horses don't understand affection, not the way people think, but they understand presence, and that's more than enough. We rode into the wind not because we chose to, but because the wind never changed its mind. No one told us where we were going. Direction wasn't a matter of destination, it was a matter of motion. You rode because someone ahead of you was already riding, because to stop was to be part of the landscape, and no one wanted to be a rock in someone else's memory. I used to wonder if the older riders knew the way, or if they were just better at pretending they weren't lost. Truth is, on the steppe, no one is ever lost. You're just between places. I remember watching one of the elders ride face like dried parchment, hands steady as carved bone, his eyes barely opened, and yet he missed no detail. His horse obeyed like it was born with his breath in its lungs. I tried to imitate him, once tried to sit tall, stare ahead, chew slow, ended up biting my tongue and nearly dropping my saddlebag. He didn't laugh, but I'm sure he noticed. The steppe teaches by letting you fail quietly. There was no talking, not because we weren't allowed, but because it didn't occur to us. Our thoughts rode with us. Our words, if any, were save for commands, danger, or goodbyes that didn't need answers. Silence wasn't awkward, it was efficient. I remember thinking once on my 7th or 8th morning that if I disappeared right then, no one would notice until the next camp. And even then, they'd just note the loss, adjust the pack lists, and move on. That wasn't cruelty, that was how you survived the distance between things. You didn't carry grief, you carried momentum. The horses sweat early, and so did we. Layers of wool stuck to our backs. The sun, when it rose, didn't bring heat, it brought visibility. You weren't grateful for it. You were aware of it. That was enough. We crossed a ridge by mid-morning. the wind whipping across the saddle like it had a grudge. I pulled my scarf higher and tasted salt my own sweat, or maybe the dust of old bones under the soil. Hard to say. The land was full of history we didn't ask for. Now, when I wake up in this old wooden chair, far from that land, I sometimes still lean forward like I'm about to mount up. Muscle memory doesn't care how many winters have passed. It just waits for orders. And the strangest thing, I miss the silence. Not the quiet of comfort, but the silence of necessary motion, that hum of bodies moving toward nothing and everything all at once. That's what morning was to us. No names, just direction. Do you remember your first morning away from home when you had to move? Not because someone told you, but because the world around you did. What we drank to stay alive. Breakfast came in a leather sack. The first time I drank Era, I thought someone had made a mistake. I was 16, hungry, tired, and handed a warm, swollen pouch that looked like it had seen better days and smelled like it never wanted to. I asked no questions. That was the rule. I took a mouthful, and the liquid bit me back. It was sour, not like spoiled milk, but like milk that had decided to become something else entirely. Something alive, something stubborn. It filled my throat with a heat that had nothing to do with temperature. My lips puckered, my stomach twisted. My pride nodded and swallowed. Next to me, a man in his 50s, scars like rivers across his cheek, grinned with half a tooth. "It's better warm," he muttered. I couldn't tell if that was comfort or threat. Airag was Suteitsai's older, meaner cousin, fermented mare's milk, churned in goat leather sacks for hours by bored hands and generations of survival. It was our coffee, our blessing, our burden. It tasted like everything we had no choice but to keep. You drank it not for flavor, but for what it promised. Strength, heat, a few moments where your body stopped shivering. It filled the belly just enough to quiet its arguments. And more importantly, it didn't spoil, not in the way food spoiled. It fought back against time. I learned later that the fermentation killed off the bacteria that might have killed us. Nature somehow turned sour milk into survival. We never questioned the science. We just drank. We didn't sit around tables. There was no cloth, no plates. You crouched in a circle, if lucky, or sat in the shadow of your horse. Meat came in strips, tough, grey, older than your memories. Cheese, if you could call it that, was harder than some rocks I've stepped on. You gnawed, not bit. Breakfast wasn't a meal. It was a measure. The elders always chewed slower, not because they enjoyed it more, but because their teeth insisted. Some softened their meat in broth. When we had fire and patience, most just used their back molars until the food gave up. I watched one man suck on a piece of bone for an hour, not because there was marrow left, but because he missed what it used to mean. The taste of Airag never got better, not really, but it changed. By the third month, I started to crave it not for the flavor, but for the ritual, the pouch passed between hands, the brief eye contact before the drink, the wipe of a mouth on a dirty sleeve that somehow meant, "You'll be fine." Funny thing, that same man with the river scars once told me, if it goes down easy, it won't keep you standing. That stayed with me longer than the drink ever did. Once, while camped near the edge of a dried-up lake, we were given a gift milk from a different tribe. Cow, not mare, sweeter, thicker. We drank it with suspicion. "Too kind," someone muttered. "Too smooth," said another. And they were right. The next day, half of us were curled in the grass, groaning like the horses. No one died, but no one forgot. After that, we went back to Airag with something like respect. Not for its taste, but for its honesty. When I try to describe it now to people here, in this modern world of smoothies and protein drinks, I don't bother with the details. I just say, it was earned, and I miss it. I really do. Not the flavor, not the churned skin against my lips, but the way it made me feel connected to the men beside me, to the horses, to the breath of the wind, and the low growl of a stomach that knew the day would be long. These days, my breakfasts are quiet things. Toast, jam, sometimes fruit. The fruit tastes like color. The jam tastes like memories I didn't live. And the coffee, well, it doesn't bite back. That's both comfort and loss. I keep a small leather pouch on my shelf. Not for use, just to remember. It smells faintly of smoke and sour. I hold it sometimes, close to my nose, and for a second, just a second, I feel 17 again. Hungry, cold, alive. Have you ever tasted something not because you liked it, but because it meant you were still trying? Clean wasn't a goal. Water was for horses, not for skin. Back then, nobody smelled good. That wasn't a secret. It wasn't even something worth mentioning. It just was. We didn't bathe. We didn't soak. We didn't sprinkle rose petals into steaming tubs. We wrapped ourselves in wool, rubbed ash into our hands, and called it enough. And the odd thing is, we weren't dirty. Not the way people think. I remember once, during a long ride through southern grasslands, we passed a river. Clean, wide, beautiful. It danced in the sun like something sent to tempt us. One of the younger boys, new to the saddle, new to the ways, got excited. Said he was going to wash. Just a quick dip. He grinned, already peeling off his belt. We all stopped and stared like he'd just declared war on himself. Someone spat. Someone else whispered, "He'll be sick by dusk." He laughed. Anyway, Dovain. And for a moment, he looked like joy itself splashing. Free. A bird in the reeds. By sundown, he was shaking in his blanket, teeth knocking like dice. Fever hit him hard. Too clean. Too fast. His body didn't know how to fight what wasn't there anymore. He lived barely. But he never washed again. Water was precious and unpredictable. You drank it. You gave it to your horse. You used it to cook. But to waste it on your skin, that was a kind of arrogance we didn't have time for. We had other methods. We scrubbed with sand, rubbed horsehair cloth against our skin until it reddened, used fat goat, sheep, anything soft to lift the grime, then wiped with old wool. The goal wasn't to sparkle, it was to function, and we smelled. Of course we did. Of sweat, of smoke, of dried blood and wet leather and grass that had been trampled one too many times. But it wasn't offensive. It was us. It meant we were moving, eating, living, fighting, breathing. I used to run my hands through my own hair and feel the grease, thick as paint. It kept the wind out, kept the sun from cracking my scalp. I didn't mind it. No one did. The only real rule, never let your boots rot. You could smell death in bad boots. A man might go a week without water, a month without decent food, but if his feet gave up, he was already halfway buried. We stuffed herbs in the toes, wiped them with oil, slept with them next to our heads, not out of superstition, but strategy. Foot rot meant failure. No horse could carry a man who couldn't stand up on his own. One time, in a dusty camp just past the Black Sands, a stranger rode in tall, pale, foreign. He wore silks. His face was shaven clean, his teeth gleamed, and he smelled odd, like flowers and powder and lies. We listened politely, offered him salted meat. He barely touched it, asked for a wash basin instead. Someone offered him a damp rag dipped in fermented milk. He left the next morning, quietly, didn't say goodbye. I never knew what happened to him, but I'd bet my saddle he didn't last the week. Looking back, I understand now. We didn't reject cleanliness, we just didn't worship it. Survival leaves little room for vanity. Even now, in this warm house with hot water and sweet soap, I sometimes let a few days go by, just to remember, just to sit with myself, unchanged. And when I do finally wash slowly, deliberately I don't scrub too hard. Some memories you don't want to rinse away. Have you ever worn the same clothes day after day? Not because you had to, but because they felt like part of you. The day I missed on purpose. My first arrow flew wide, maybe on purpose. The first time I rode toward battle, I couldn't feel my fingers. Not from fear, just cold. But maybe the two aren't all that different. We were riding east, no banners, no drums. Mongols didn't announce ourselves. We arrived like a shift in the wind. Silent, fast, undeniable. My horse moved with a grace I hadn't earned. He knew where we were going before I did. He always did. I was 19, maybe 20. I didn't count years back then, only winters, and this one had already bitten hard. We came over a low ridge at dawn. Frost still held the tall grass. A few smokes curled from clay huts below. Chickens, a boy with a pail, that was it. And then the signal came. A single bird call sharp, unnatural, wrong for the season. We moved. The first man I saw was barefoot. He ran from a doorway, eyes wide, holding a sickle meant for crops, not warriors. I remember thinking how odd it looked, that curve of rusted metal trembling in his hand. He wasn't charging. He was defending, or maybe just afraid. I notched my arrow, pulled back, felt the leather grip in my hand, heard the creak of the bowstring, but I aimed just to the left of him, and I let go. The arrow sang through the air and struck dirt. A warning shot. I told myself, a beginner's mistake. Gantulga, riding 2 paces to my right, laughed. "That was generous," he shouted. "Wanna try again? With your eyes open." I didn't answer. He loosed 3 arrows in rapid fire. All hit their marks. We swept through that village like a brush fire. Fast, efficient. We didn't stop to count. We didn't stop for anything. The others. They moved like they'd done this 100 times. Because they had, I lagged, not visibly, just enough to keep from being at the front. Enough to avoid that moment, the moment you recognize someone as human before you hurt them. That's the danger of eye contact. Later, around the fire, someone tossed a roasted bird into my lap. "You hesitated," Gantulga said, chewing with his mouth open. "You only get to do that once." I nodded, said nothing. He leaned closer. "Don't worry, it gets easier." I looked at him, face still smooth, eyes already sharp as his arrows. "I hope not," I said. Gantulga wasn't cruel, exactly. He just believed in finishing things, quickly, cleanly. Whether it was a ride, a meal, or a man, he slept soundly that night. I didn't. I lay on my side, listening to the horses breathe, my fingers still twitching, as if they remembered the bowstring. I watched the stars, thought about the boy with the pail, wondered if he'd made it out. Then I reminded myself wondering was a luxury, not a duty. Still, I couldn't stop. The next morning, the elders didn't scold me. They didn't have to. My arrow had spoken for me, and they'd heard it, but no one mocked me either. That's something, even among warriors, there's room for pause, just not for too long. That day taught me 2 things. First, you never really forget the face of someone you almost killed. And second, sometimes, the best aim is one that lets both of you live. Do you remember the first time you had to hurt someone and chose not to? We were never running. Retreat wasn't shameful. It was brilliant. They called it cowardice, those who didn't understand. They saw us turn our horses, flee across open fields, vanish into the hills, and they smiled, thought they'd won. They didn't see what came next. We weren't running. We were luring. I learnt the trick on my 3rd campaign. It was late spring, near the river bend where the grass grew thick and the flies bit hard. The commander, a short, wide man who spoke like he'd been chewing gravel, gave the signal. We rode forward, fast, loud, arrows in the sky like rain. Then, just as the enemy formed their line, we broke, wheeled left, pulled back. The others followed. I hesitated. Running didn't feel right until I saw what came after. They chased us. Not because they were stupid, but because they thought we'd made a mistake. People always believe what flatters them. We led them into a ravine. Narrow, shadowed, quiet. That's when the second wave came from the ridge. Archers waiting like stones with teeth. It wasn't a battle. It was math. Gantulga rode beside me, grinning. They always fall for it, he said, loosing an arrow without even looking. I'd never seen such precision in chaos. Horses thundered. Men screamed. The dust curled like smoke from a burning truth. Back in camp that night, the fire crackled softly. Gantulga poked it with his knife. They think bravery means charging forward, he said. But it's smarter to let someone run into their own pride. I didn't respond, just watched the embers dance. He handed me a strip of dried meat. Eat. You earned it. I chewed slowly. It tasted like victory and ash. After that, I studied the movements. The half turn of the horse, the weight shift, the exact moment when to veer left so it looked like panic. Not pattern. You had to sell the fear. Had to look back over your shoulder not out of worry, but to bait theirs. Had to cough just loud enough to sound wounded. Even your horse had to learn how to limp believably. It was acting, but better, because it mattered. The tactic worked so well. We used it more often than brute force. Why break a wall when you can invite someone to open their gate? People said Mongols were ruthless, and maybe we were, but we were also thoughtful. We didn't win by muscle. We won by noticing things, where the wind carried sound, which path gave less dust, how far a man would run when he thought he had the upper hand. Later, I asked the commander why we never bragged about those victories, why we didn't paint stories of cunning on leather walls. He shrugged. No one sings about being smart, he said. They only sing about dying loudly. We weren't heroes, we were calculators, with horses instead of numbers, arrows instead of ink, and a memory for mistakes that kept us breathing. Now, when I hear people talk about bravery, about charging in, never looking back, I nod politely. But part of me always thinks, sometimes the wisest thing you can do is turn around and let the fool come to you. Have you ever stepped back, not out of fear, but because you saw the path others didn't? No celebrations, just stew. After battle, there were no songs, only the smell of stew. When dawn broke on the day after a fight, there was no triumph in the air. No cheers, no drums, no healer's chants. Instead, there was smoke thin, steady, and the low, methodical stir of a pot over coals. That pot was our altar. The meat inside was our offering to survival. Not victory. I stirred the stew with a stick, listening to its bubble. Floating in thick broth were charred cuts of goat chewy, soaked in ash, dense as regret. No salt, no herb, even the smoke felt unchanged. It was honest food, food that knew you hadn't slept, that your throat still tasted of battle. Some mornings, we ate with our hands, passing chunks around in silence. The warrior beside me snapped the bone, sucked the marrow, then tossed it into the dirt. There was a soft crunch, and he shrugged. Maybe that was our release small sounds. Necessary sounds, reminding us we were still alive. Mongols prized fat above all else, not for taste, but for survival. Fat burned. Fat kept the cold off your bones. Fat fed your brain so you could think instead of freeze. I buried my appetite in that greasy chunk, letting its warmth seep inside, pushing reminders of the day arrows, hooves, dust just a little further from the surface. Around the fire, Guntulga broke a rib and showed me how to crack it just right. He talked about small things, how marrow tasted different in winter, how to find better coals, how to break a bone without losing the steam. For a moment, he wasn't a warrior, he was just a man teaching a skill. That's the thing about fire, it softens edges. But only for a moment. I sat, chewing. The dust of the fight had settled, but it lay on our clothes, on our tongues, on our bones. You could wipe it off if you had water, which we didn't. Still, picking at that stew felt like choosing life again. And sometimes, life didn't need fanfare. At some point, one of the younger riders began humming a low, tuneless thing. It ended when a horse shifted on the fringe of firelight. We all listened. That single sound felt like a bridge, between then and now, between safe and not, between brave and just awake. We didn't speak, we ate, we listened, and slowly, that hum became enough. In that pause, I realized something I'd started learning late. You don't need a feast after war. You need comfort, something warm, something steady, something that stays when the arrows stop. That stew stayed. It didn't erase the fight, but it reminded us that we could still hold food in our hands and not let an old fear steal it. The law was a nod. Justice came without a robe. Just a look and sometimes a stone. There were no judges in long robes, no scrolls with complicated words, no gongs, no gavels. Our laws didn't wear jewelry. They wore boots, and their decisions fit into a single breath. Mongol justice was like the wind swift, sharp and hard to argue with. I remember the first time I saw it. A man had stolen a horse. Not from the enemy, not even from a stranger, but from his own brother. Took it at night, rode it past the ridge to trade for fermented wine and a woman with tired eyes. He came back drunk, grinning, and tied the horse up like it was still his. We all knew by morning. No one shouted. No one pointed. We just watched. And then, when the sun reached the height of a man's shoulder, the elder came over slow steps, quiet voice, and said, "Walk now." That was it. He didn't argue, didn't cry, just took off his riding boots, placed them neatly next to the horse, and started walking. To be made a walker was worse than any wound. No one carried you. No one waited. You followed the dust trail of others and tried not to fall behind. And in the step, falling behind meant forgetting your name before the grass did. Sometimes, if your shame was heavy enough, even your horse would refuse you. They knew the law wasn't written, but it was real. Steel. You walk. Li. You sit at the edge of the fire, back to the warmth. Kill without reason. You bury the body. Then the shovel. There was no prison, just distance. You were exiled without being sent anywhere, just kept outside the warmth of movement, the rhythm of trust. And it worked, because fear wasn't our teacher. Belonging was, we fought for the same water, shared the same fire, ate from the same hand-stitched pouch. So when someone broke that invisible line between mine and ours, they weren't punished. They were removed, gently, firmly, permanently. One time, a boy accused another of theft. The elders asked only one question: why now? The answer didn't satisfy, so both boys had to carry a stone tied to their waist for a week. Not because the stone meant guilt, but because it meant weight. Every step reminded them that truth wasn't always about facts. Sometimes, it was about timing. We weren't saints, far from it, but we understood something that still feels rare now. When rules are simple and trust is high, justice doesn't need volume, just a look. Just a nod, even now, sitting here with old bones and soft cushions. I sometimes think back to that man walking away his boots by the horse, his shadow long and quiet behind him. He didn't disappear, he just stepped outside of us. The horse that stole my name. I stole a horse once, not for glory, just for bread. They say every man has a moment he'd rather fold into the wind and forget. Mine was tied to a short, scrappy bay mare with one white sock and eyes that looked like they already forgave me. It was the hunger, not the kind that makes you dizzy. Worse, the kind that hums in your bones for days. Quiet but steady, until you start forgetting the difference between want and need. We were 3 days out from camp, moving slow because a cart had snapped its wheel, and supplies were stretched tight. I hadn't eaten anything warm in over a week. My ribs pressed like fingers from inside. I was tired of chewing leather just to pretend. That night, I waited until most were asleep. The horses were tethered near the scrub grass, and the night was clear and star-heavy. My fingers shook not from fear, but from the cold that crawled up a man's stomach when it's empty too long. I didn't take her far, just rode hard enough to reach the outer camp where merchants passed through, traded her quick, quiet for a hunk of salted goat, 2 pouches of millet, and a flask of ereg. I ate too fast, didn't even taste it, just swallowed until I remembered what warmth felt like again. I returned at dawn, empty-handed, walking, didn't try to lie, didn't explain. The commander looked at me, just looked, long enough that the shame sank through my shoulders and out my heels. He didn't raise his voice, just said, "Walk now." Same 3 words I'd heard said to others. This time, they tasted like stone. I walked for 2 weeks, dust in my mouth, blisters inside my boots. I followed behind the camp, never quite catching up. Ate her scraps, slept with the gear animals, and no one said a word. Not out of cruelty, but because justice had already been spoken. When I finally re-earned a horse after proving myself in supply runs and endurance drills, the animal they gave me wasn't a reward. He was work. Old, stiff-kneed, with one ear chewed off from a fight. He hated me, and I didn't blame him. It took months before he let me ride without biting. Years before I stopped hearing the quiet judgment in the hooves of every step. They never called me by name during that time. Just boy. Or you. It wasn't until I delivered a message between 2 scattered camps, 3 days of rain, wolves on the trail, one broken rib that the elder finally handed me a saddle and said, "You ride now, with us." That night, someone said my name again, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was borrowing it. The mare I'd traded, I never saw her again, but I still remember the look she gave me when I untied her. Not hate, not fear, just resignation. Like she knew I'd been weighed and found wanting and did what I had to. Sometimes, I dream of her, running across a wide plain, her white sock flashing in the moonlight, not looking back, and I hope, wherever she ended up, she ran free. He spoke softly, so we listened harder. The loudest voice in the camp barely whispered. He wasn't tall. He wasn't fast. And if you passed him in the road, you might mistake him for someone's uncle come to deliver oats. But when the elder spoke, the whole camp leaned in because he never raised his voice. Not once. His name was Batar. We never called him Sir, or Leader, or anything heavy like that. Just Batar. Sometimes just a look was enough. Sometimes he'd flick his fingers toward the horizon and 100 men would ride without question. He had a way of seeing things 2 days before they happened. Clouds thickening in the north. He'd shorten our trail. A certain smell in the air. He'd have us change horses before dusk. A quiet twitch in a new recruit's left hand. He'd assign him to supply duty, and we'd later find out he'd hidden an infected wound. Batar didn't need maps. He had instincts, and they were rarely wrong. One winter, the river froze harder than usual. Supplies were thin, tempers were thinner. A boy accused another of hoarding grain. Tensions sparked. Batar didn't interrupt. He waited, then walked to the fire, pulled out 2 bowls, filled each with the same watery stew, set them down between the boys. "You eat together," he said, "or walk separately." They shared, neither ever brought it up again. Batar understood that law didn't need teeth, it needed roots. He never scolded. He reminded, "Leave the saddle by your tent," he'd say quietly. And sure enough, the next morning you'd find that same saddle cleaned, oiled, and your horse chewing calmly by the flap. I once saw him stare down a thief without saying a word, just looked at him across the fire. The man left his pouch behind and walked out into the dark. Batar never said where he'd gone. He just nodded once, like a chapter had closed. Some believed he'd once been a feared warrior. Others said he'd lost someone in an early campaign and had chosen gentleness as his armor. We never asked because his silence wasn't empty. It was full of choices. He taught us more with one eyebrow than some did with speeches. When I limped into camp one night, bleeding, saddle torn, pride worse off than my leg, he just glanced at the wound and said, "You rode hard." That was it. That was how he forgave you. Not with pardon, with acknowledgement. I've met men who shouted to command. Batar didn't have to. His quiet was heavier than their thunder. The ridges we never named. Not all places were meant to be remembered by name. There were hills we crossed where no one spoke. No marks were left. No stories were told later by the fire. No one claimed them in song. They weren't cursed, just sacred in their forgetting. Those were the ridges we never named. I remember one in particular. The air changed when we approached. It turned still, like even the birds had agreed to hold their breath. The ground was dry, but soft. Our horses stepped quieter than usual, hooves muffled as though walking on cloth. Batar lifted one hand, a small gesture, and we dismounted without a word. We walked our horses across that stretch, not out of fear, but out of something older, something heavier than reason. No one knew what had happened there. Maybe a burial ground, maybe the site of a slaughter, maybe just a place where too many prayers had gone unanswered. But every hoof that touched that dirt did so gently. Every breath we drew felt like a trespass. And when we reached the other side, Batar mounted first and said only, "Now we ride." That night, someone asked why we hadn't lit a fire. Gantulga just chewed on his meat and shrugged. The ground was full, he said. No one asked what he meant. There are places like that. You felt them, even if you didn't know the history. A bend in a road that makes you slow, a tree you pass that makes you straighten your back, a field that hums with something not quite sound. We don't always need to know why. We just need to listen. Sometimes, I think we overfill our world with names. We label rivers and peaks and patches of sky, hoping it'll help us own them. But the old ones knew. Some places don't want your stories. They've already heard too many, and the only proper thing to do is pass through with reverence and silence. In all my years riding after that, I never asked for that ridge's name, and no one offered it. It remained what it was, a space between steps, a hush between heartbeats, a reminder that history is not always meant to be told. Some of it is meant to be felt. When we sang low, our songs weren't for celebration. They were for remembering. We didn't sing loudly, not like the southern tribes, with their drums and high voices echoing into the stars. No, our songs rode low in the chest, like something that had been waiting too long to be spoken. We sang at night, not every night, just the ones where the wind didn't argue and the fire stayed steady. Those were the evenings when memory softened its grip, and a man could hum without tears finding him. The songs didn't have titles, not really. They were passed from elder to child like warm bread meant to be shared, not labelled. They told of rivers that changed their beds, of horses that didn't come back, of mothers who packed milk into cloth and waited by the mountain until the snow cleared. They weren't ballads, they were truths wrapped in melody. I remember one voice especially, an older man, his hair thin, eyes milky with age, who sang like his ribs were made of hollow wood. He didn't have teeth anymore, but the words still came, soft and wet and full of ache. He sang one night after we buried a boy too young to have a beard. No speech, just a song, 4 lines, no repeats. And when he finished, the silence that followed held more weight than grief. Gantulga never sang, said it wasn't in his blood. But one night, when his horse died under him, a beast he'd raised from foal to fighter, he hummed a low, flat note as he braided the tail and tied it around his wrist. That was his song, one note, held like breath in the dark. I tried once when I was 23 and heartsick over a girl who chose steadiness over speed. I climbed a ridge and let out something between a tune and a groan. Didn't rhyme, didn't rise, just drifted down the hill like fog. Felt better after, though sometimes that's all a song is for. We didn't sing for audiences. We sang for the things that didn't leave when you stopped speaking. Regret, memory, love that had no place to go. Even now, with a voice that cracks like old wood, I hum sometimes. At the stove, on the porch, while folding clothes that haven't been worn in years. I don't need lyrics, just the shape of something that once held me. The time the sky forgot us. We weren't lost. The sky just stopped watching. It started as a breath of wind that didn't belong. Sharp, sour, wrong. Bata smelled it first, lifted his nose like a dog, then pointed at the edge of the horizon where the grass looked heavier. No one spoke. We adjusted our straps, loosened the packs, closed our coats, then the sky disappeared. Sandstorms don't knock. They arrive like old deaths suddenly, and with no patience. One moment, the air was clear. The next, it tasted like rust and memory. My horse shivered, not from cold, but from knowing. Gantulga shouted something, but the sound vanished before it reached me. That's the part no one tells you. Storms steal sound first. Visibility dropped to the length of your arm. Men vanished 5 feet away, shapes bent and blurred. Colors didn't matter. The sky pressed down not from above, but from inside. It felt like the earth forgot which way was up. We dismounted. You can't ride blind. Not if you want your horse to keep its legs. I wrapped my scarf over my face, closed my eyes, and counted my breaths. It wasn't panic. It was containment. You become a shell. You wait. You stay small. The storm doesn't care about your fear, but it notices your movement. For 3 days, we were smothered in yellow silence. No birds, no sun, just wind and grit and the taste of copper in your throat. We found each other by sound. A cough here, a tap on wood there. A prayer, maybe whispered not to be heard. But to prove the voice still existed, Bata never raised his voice. He simply tapped his staff twice when it was time to shift. Those who heard moved. Those who didn't, we waited for. No one was left behind, even in blindness. We were still us. When the sky finally cleared, the world looked scraped clean. Trees stripped, tents shredded, eyes raw from sand that found its way behind even the best leather. But we were still upright. And somehow, we felt earned. Gantulga spat into the dirt and said, "I thought the sky had forgotten us." Bata replied, "Maybe it needed time to remember. I've lived through war, famine, betrayal, but that storm, the way it made everything silent. Then Holy has stayed with me longest. Because it wasn't about what we lost, it was about what we held on to. Each other. Direction, breath, how we mark the dead. We didn't bury them. We gave them back to the sky. There were no gravestones on the step, no carved names, no painted wood, no fresh dirt turned and tended. Our dead didn't rest below. They rose. When a rider died, we didn't mourn like other people. No loud wails, no cloaks of black, no long lines of speech. We mourned in silence and ritual. The horse was brought forward first. Always the horse, its saddle removed, cleaned, and hung from a branch or, if no tree was near, from a simple wooden pole stuck deep in the earth. The stirrups left to sway in the wind, as if the rider might return any moment to place his boots there again. That was the start. Then came the bundle. We wrapped our fallen in felt and wool. Never tight, never forced, just enough to keep them warm one last time. And then we found a high place. The body was left on a ridge, or beneath a lone tree, or sometimes on an open slope where the wind had room to speak. We believed the spirit needed space. It couldn't rise if weighed down. We didn't dig. To dig was to cage. We gave the dead back to the sky so the birds could carry them, piece by piece, into eternity. It might sound harsh, but to us, it was holy. I remember the first time I helped with the rite. I was young, barely trusted with a knife, let alone a soul. The man who died had been quiet in life, laughed rarely, rode fast, never lost a game of bones. His name was Cerdan, though no one said it aloud that day. Bartar led the small group. We climbed in single file, no songs, just boots on stone and breath in the wind. At the top, we laid Cerdan down. His hands were folded, not across his chest, but resting at his sides, as if he'd just stopped to nap. Someone placed a tuft of horsehair beside him, then we turned our backs and walked away. That was the rule. You don't watch the sky reclaim its own. 3 days later, a hawk circled above camp, low, lazy, at peace. Bartar looked up and said, "He's almost home." We never visited the same ridge twice. No monuments, no trails, because our grief wasn't about holding on. It was about letting go properly. Even now, when someone I love passes in this quieter, modern world with funeral homes and glossy paper, I sometimes step outside at dawn, look up, and whisper their name into the wind just once. That's all it takes, I think, for the sky to remember what a saddle can hold. You didn't ride a horse. You lived with one. There's something most people don't understand about the saddle. They think it's just a seat leather, wood, stitching something you throw over a beast and strap tight before a ride. But a saddle, to us, was more than gear. It was home. Each man shaped his own overtime. Not carved it, not built it, but bent it gently with the weight of his body and the wear of years. The leather took your imprint, your worries, your triumphs. It remembered how you rode when you were strong and how you slouched when grief found you. The saddle knew everything. Mine was stitched from thick hide by an uncle who never rode himself bad knees from a hunting accident, but who treated tack with the reverence of a priest. "This piece," he said, holding up a side strap, "holds your pride. This one," he whispered, touching the cantle, "holds your breath." I didn't understand until later, when I rode into storms. The saddle gave me balance. When I sat waiting at a border, the saddle caught my thoughts. And when I lost friends, it held my silence without complaint. Inside the side pouches were things no one needed to see. A feather from a bird I once saved, a piece of carved bone from my mother's kitchen, 2 dried berries from a summer camp long gone, and once a lock of hair wrapped in cloth. That saddle wasn't just for movement, it was memory. Every scratch told a story. The tear from when a wolf lunged too close, the burn mark from a campfire that flared too fast, the stitching repaired with string not meant for leather but held. Anyway, like most things in a rider's life, it wasn't beautiful, but it was trusted. We never lent our saddles, even among brothers, not because we feared theft, but because it wouldn't fit. Another man's weight, another man's rhythm, it changed the soul of the thing, like trying on someone else's past. Or it just felt wrong. One time, my horse died during a crossing old, tired. Legs gave out in a riverbed. We pulled him to shore, quietly. Without drama, I removed the saddle last, held it in my lap for a long while. It was still warm, and it smelled like him. I didn't ride for days after. Not out of grief, not exactly, but because the saddle was still adjusting, still listening for a heartbeat that wasn't there anymore. Now, it hangs in my shed, worn smooth, untouched, but not forgotten. Sometimes I run my hand across the seat, feel the echo of myself at 17. At 30, at 100 places I'll never see again. The ones who stayed quiet, Not all warriors needed weapons. Some fought with silence. There were always those among us who didn't shout, didn't sing, didn't gallop out ahead with spears raised and hair whipping the wind. They were the ones who moved quietly, who cooked before dawn, who fixed saddles when no one was looking, who noticed when someone's hand shook, or when a horse was limping before its rider saw. They didn't fight for glory, they fought to keep the rest of us whole. We had a woman in camp older than most, hair already threaded with snow. No one knew exactly where she came from. She didn't ride, didn't carry weapons. But if you were sick, she knew before you did. If your tent flap fluttered too much in the night, hers would already be mended. She never asked questions, but she always had answers. I once saw her pick up a broken arrow, sniff the shaft, and say, "Rain coming tomorrow." She was right. Then there was Bilek, a boy who stuttered so badly he rarely spoke. But he had the hands of a spirit, soft, fast, sure. He could calm a wounded foal with just a palm, tie a knot in thick rope with his eyes closed, draw maps from memory that never steered us wrong. He saved more lives than half the warriors combined, and yet he never wore armor. Gantulga used to laugh at them, the quiet ones, said they were soft, said they didn't belong. But the day his brother fell in a ditch and shattered his leg, it was Bilek who carried him step by step 6 miles back to camp. No one mocked Bilek after that, not even Gantulga. The quiet ones didn't ride at the front, but they kept our horses alive, kept the fires lit, kept us from becoming just killers. They reminded us that survival wasn't only about speed or sharpness. It was about tending, about noticing, about stillness. Sometimes, when I couldn't sleep, I'd sit near the woman's tent. She'd hum, soft and tuneless, while mending gloves or crushing herbs. And in that moment, I felt more protected than in any battle line. The quiet ones don't make it into songs. They're not carved into rock. But if you ever survive something you didn't think you would, chances are one of them was nearby, just outside the firelight, watching, steady, still, echoes in the dust. You leave tracks, but the wind always remembers. Time does strange things to the memory of a place. Grass grows where arrows once fell. Birds nest in trees once used for lookout. And the wind carries everything forward, then backward, then forward again, like it's unsure what to keep. But dust holds echoes, not of words, but of weight. Years after I stopped riding, I returned to one of our old camps, not for ceremony, just curiosity, or maybe guilt. The trees had thickened, the stones had shifted, but I still saw us there, not as ghosts, as echoes, a stirrup groove in the dirt where Gantulga used to sleep on his saddle blanket, a bent nail poking from a blackened log, right where the stew pot used to hang, even a small patch of trampled ground that, for reasons I can't explain, still smelled faintly of horse sweat and tobacco. Nothing spoke, but everything remembered. I knelt and touched the ground, my palm warm against the soil. I said no words. There weren't any that felt right. Instead, I just breathed. Let the wind pass through me the way it always had back then, when it filled my coat and whispered across my face, letting me know I was alive. And I realized something. We thought we were temporary, nomads, riders, men without roots. But the places we passed through, they kept pieces of our breath, of our fear, of our laughter, low and half swallowed in the night. I sat for a long while. Birds circled above. The air had that old weight to it again, like it remembered the press of hooves, the iron of blood, the crackle of a fire where names were once spoken and then forgotten again. I didn't leave a mark when I left that day. No sign, no stone, no name carved in bark, just my footprints, and maybe one more whisper in the wind. The story the fire keeps. Some stories don't end. They just keep warming the dark. Even now, years later, the fire still talks to me, not in words, not even in memories, but in the way it shifts, how it crackles low when a name comes to mind, or how it flares soft when I think of someone I never properly said goodbye to. The fire doesn't ask for much, just wood and time. And if you sit long enough, it gives something back. There are stories I haven't told, not because they're secrets, but because they're not finished. Like the one about the boy who rode west and never returned, or the woman who taught me how to braid horsehair into knots that could hold meaning, not just weight. Or the moment quiet and strange when Bartar looked up from his stew and said, "One day, none of us will be remembered, but the fire will still burn." I didn't understand what he meant until now. You see, we thought we were making history, but really, we were making embers, small, flickering truths that would float into someone else's sky one day, maybe land in their hands, maybe help them see better in the dark. That's the thing about the fire. It doesn't care if the story is true, only if it's honest. I've told you about the arrows, the horses, the dust, the shame, but what I hope you carry isn't any one fact. It's the feeling of warmth on your face after a long cold, of silence shared between tired friends, of the moment you realize you're still here. Maybe that's why I keep this fire going. Not because I'm afraid of the night, but because I want to give something back to it. A little light, a little story, a little piece of a life that rode through more than it should have, and still found ways to sit down, chew slowly, and remember, the candle's still flickering. Some lights don't go out, they just stay low waiting. I keep a small candle near my bed. It's not for reading, not for prayer, just there, flickering softly in the quiet, long after the world has stopped asking anything of me. Some nights, I light it. Other nights, I don't need to, because its glow, even when imagined, is enough. People think legacies are loud statues, parades, stories shouted across generations, but most of what matters is small. A scarf worn thin by someone long gone. The way your hand remembers a saddle, even if you haven't ridden in years. A song you don't realize you're humming until you hear the silence around you change. I've forgotten many names, but I remember how they sat, how they ate, how they laughed low and covered their mouth like they didn't deserve joy, but let it out anyway. The world moves fast now, too fast, maybe, but this candle, this little flame, it doesn't rush. It waits, it listens, it reminds. Sometimes I sit beside it and whisper things I never said out loud, like how I once missed on purpose, or how I still see her in the wind, braiding clouds like horsehair, or how Bartar's voice never raised still hums beneath my own when I speak slowly. I don't know if the candle hears me, but I like to think it keeps something, the way the fire did, the way the step did, the way you have, maybe, just by listening. So if you're still awake, if this voice still lingers in your chest like a warm stone in a coat pocket, then the candle has done its job. It doesn't end. It just flickers, waiting for the next night.